I opened a Substack account recently. It wasn't anything I had been planning to do. In fact, I'm not usually an eager adopter of social media. In case you haven't heard of Substack yet, it's an online app and a website, a publishing platform. It's sort of like TikTok or Facebook, but it's for writers and podcasters. You're not limited in length like you are on most other social media platforms, so you can pretty much write as much as you want to. And as with most social media, your readers can respond to what you've written and dialogue with you. The reason I signed up for Substack was, in my mind, very unlikely. Our son started writing weekly articles about real estate, land use, and public policy in Dallas, Texas. Now, to say that Robin and I are surprised that he is willingly writing very long articles with no other reason than to share his knowledge and opinion is an understatement. We, his parents, remember his childhood. This was the very smart son for whom homework assignments were almost always a struggle. And it was usually Robin who wrestled with Kirk each week in order to get him to write out his spelling words into the required sentences. You know how when you see someone in a certain way, and no matter how much time has passed or how much they may have changed, it's hard to see them any other way? Such is the life of a parent, I guess. They have to grow up sometime. And now, as a 30-year-old, my son is freely publishing these cleverly written and well-researched 3,000-word essays about civic life in Dallas, Texas. And I love reading them. I just never imagined myself here. But in the process of reading my son's articles, I've been introduced to several other writers, many of whom I already knew of but didn't realize they were on Substack. One of those is Leonard Sweet. He's an ordained United Methodist, a pastor, a writer, a theologian. And just last week, he posted a Substack article that fit right into our Preparing a People worship series. And the gist of that article was basically is that you shouldn't consider the story of Jacob wrestling without remembering the story of Abraham taking Isaac up Mount Moriah for the sacrifice. And then in that same week, I came across online an article from one of my own seminary's professors, John Holbert, who said that you shouldn't preach about what happens in today's reading from chapter 32 of Genesis without also including what comes next in chapter 33, when Jacob finally confronts his brother Esau. Of course, none of those considerations mention the fact that just since last Sunday's sermon, we've skipped over 3 chapters in the story of Jacob, which means that today, as I wrap up our worship series on Preparing a People, if I follow all these smart writers' recommendations, I've got about 12 chapters of Genesis to include as I preach. So I hope you packed a lunch. In Genesis 32, Jacob and his family have finally left the homestead of his father-in-law Laban, who's responsible for much of Jacob's present circumstances. Laban has deceived him into marrying sisters, Leah and Rachel, whose conflict and competition with each other resulted in dozens of children with them. Laban is also responsible indirectly for Jacob's wealth. He agreed to give Jacob all of his spotted and speckled livestock, not knowing that Jacob would use magical means to multiply them while suppressing the fertility of the solidly colored stock. So if you add up all the livestock and the people, Jacob and his entourage could have easily numbered upwards of 1,000. This was not a nimble group. It was like relocating the population of a small city from one town to another. And as Jacob leaves his father-in-law, he crosses paths with his brother Esau. Jacob is terrified, and for good reason. The last words of Esau reported to him by their mother Rebekah was that Esau intended to kill Jacob for taking his birthright. So first Jacob sends words to his brother that he's coming, that he's quite wealthy, and that he wishes to find favor in his brother's sight. And the response is swift. Esau approaches with 400 men. Jacob is terrified. He prays for divine assistance and then takes matters into his own hands by setting aside a significant portion of his holdings and sending them ahead as a gift to Esau. All of this happens before our reading begins today. Jacob is facing the very real possibility that Esau will kill him for taking his birthright. He has not heard back from his messengers. He doesn't know if Esau has accepted his gifts. He does not know if his servants are even still alive. And yet he sends his wives and children into the path of Esau and his riders without him. Now remember, Jacob's family and possessions is a very slow-moving caravan. It didn't happen quickly. And where is Jacob? He's either in or at the ford of the river, that spot in the river where the water is shallow enough for people and animals to safely wade across. Not a bridge, but I'm guessing bridges were few and far between 4,000 years ago. The name of the river, Jabbok, in Hebrew, Yabak, means emptying. And that's exactly what Jacob is experiencing here. All his family and his wealth have crossed over. He's burned the bridges with his uncle behind him, and Esau wants to kill him up ahead. In this moment, Jacob is empty of all the things that he's worked so hard to obtain: his wealth, his family, his status, and his relationships. And he's alone. Well, he does have one thing. He has a promise from God that God will be with him, given once in a dream. But he's not exactly lived the life of a spiritual hero. Does God's promise still hold, or does it end here? The days of pretending to be Esau are long over. He can't go back, and he's afraid to go forward. And so he sits in the neither here nor there space of the ford of the Jabbok River, the emptying river, as night falls, contemplating how he ended up here, perhaps on the last night of his life. Whatever Jacob has been running from, he's not running anymore. As the songwriters say, he has nowhere left to run. I was racking my brain trying to come up with some perfect illustration for my own life when I had nowhere left to run. Luckily, I guess, I came up empty-handed. But then I read something from John Holbert. He said, if you haven't yet found yourself in the ford of the Jabbok, a place in life where you're unable to go back and afraid to go forward, wrestling down past events and praying into what seems like a void for help, if you haven't been there, you will, or at least for the sake of your spiritual growth, you should. And that's when I thought, maybe I haven't had anything in my life as dramatic as what Jacob experienced, but I think most of us know what it means to be mentally or spiritually stuck, knowing we don't want to go back to what was and unsure where to go next. For a moment, I want to jump back to our United Methodist theologian, Leonard Sweet, to something he said. I heard him do the Bible study at one of our annual conferences held out in Collierville several years ago. As a part of the study, he said that too often we approach the Bible like an orange when we should treat it more like an apple. We too often carefully peel off the outer skin and pull it apart into sections like an orange and enjoy just one small slice at a time, when we should just pick it up and take a big bite out of it like an apple, peel and seeds and core and all. In other words, the Bible is best consumed whole, not in pieces. If you focus in on one little spot and ignore the rest, you are failing to see the grand design. So it came to no surprise to me that Leonard Sweet had drawn a line from Abraham and Isaac to this moment of Jacob wrestling in the ford of the river, and then ultimately all the way forward to Jesus. And what he said caught my attention because I've had those very same questions about Abraham before. Why, when Abraham took Isaac up the mountain for the sacrifice, why didn't Abraham argue or bargain with God? I mean, throughout all the previous chapters of Genesis, there's been this back and forth, what Leonard Sweet calls a developing friendship going on between God and Abraham, as if God was enjoying making an earthly friend for the very first time. And now when the command comes to take Isaac out, Abraham just quietly and obediently follows God's command with no rebuttal, no argument. No hint of surely we can work this out another way from Abraham to God. Sweet says that Abraham passed the obedience test, but he failed the friendship test by making no attempt to dialogue with God. And as a result, even though the ram appeared as a substitute for Isaac, Abraham still ends up going down the mountain without Isaac. Isaac goes down the mountain another way to never return home, and Sarah apparently never sees either of them ever again. And God, the God who watched the stars with him, who let him laugh and bargain and rage, God never speaks to Abraham directly again either. The man who had the most intimate friendship with God in human history to that point finishes his life unable to get God on the line. After Mount Moriah, Abraham only ever speaks about God, never again with God. God had gone quiet. Abraham, who began by leaving everyone to follow God, ended by losing everyone and God. He passed the obedience test, but he came down the mountain relationally bankrupt. Abraham was the man who crossed over when he was told to. He crossed the Euphrates. He crossed the desert. He is and remains the patron saint of going. No one ever surpassed his willingness to leave. But on Mount Moriah, he crossed over a line of a different kind, from a friend who wrestles with God into a functionary who complies. Some have said he moved from being a friend to being a servant. Servants obey because they are commanded. Friends obey because they know and trust the heart of the one who's asking. Servants need instructions. Friends share understanding. Servants complete assignments. Friends share a life. Now back to Jacob. A man comes, from where we're not told, and he and Jacob begin to wrestle, and the struggle continues throughout the night. By morning, Jacob has a new name, Israel. And Jacob is convinced that the man was God and has finally earned his own blessing instead of just taking the blessing that belonged to his brother. But it has come with a cost. Jacob has to limp across the river, but he does so with a new identity and a much deeper understanding of grace. And it's in that statement, I think, that we may find a clue to what the story is getting at. Jacob has in fact wrestled his whole life and has in fact won each bout. He's grabbed Esau's heel at birth. He's wrestled with Esau for birthright and blessing. He's wrestled with God for the divine blessing. He's wrestled with Laban in multiple events. And in all these things, he has won. Jacob is the ultimate example of triumph. And standing at the Jabbok amidst the glow of the rising sun, holding his championship wrestling belt over a head, he announces in his best Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson voice that he has now seen God face to face and come out alive. But Jacob's victory, like a scripted TV wrestling show, is self-proclaimed. Many have named the story God wrestling, but only Jacob makes that claim. And since he is one of the least trustworthy figures in the Bible, why should we believe him when he says it? And here's what Professor Holbert says we need to include chapter 33. After all of Jacob's worry that his brother wants to kill him, he leaves the river ready to accept his fate. Except who he finds waiting for him is not the man he is expecting. You remember how I said That when you see someone in a certain way, and no matter how much time has passed or how much they may have changed, it's hard to see them in another way? Well, this is still his brother Esau. But whatever anger had once been there has now dissolved. Esau runs to Jacob, embraces him, kisses him, and the two brothers weep together. Holbert suggests that Jacob did not in fact see God after the wrestling match. Rather, it's now, in front of his brother Esau, that he announces, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such grace." It is Esau's grace that opens Jacob's eyes to God. It is then that God is fully revealed. If I were to ask you where you are in your faith right now, does it look like Abraham? Did you have a good relationship once that just sort of cooled off over time? You started to feel more like a servant and less like friends with God? You're still obedient, but you've reached the whatever stage of your relationship. You've just sort of given up on it. Are you more in the Jacob camp these days? You're wrestling. Maybe this faith thing hasn't come as easy as of late, and now you're trying to figure things out. You're wrestling with all the things people wrestle with: dreams, fears, doubts, your past, maybe sometimes even wrestling with the truth. What is over on the other side of the river that's keeping you stuck where you are right now? If you only hear one thing today, let it be this: it's better to wrestle with God than it is to give up. Better to hang on with everything you've got than to just let go. Emmanuel, my hope is that we could be the kind of people who aren't afraid to grab the mystery of God and hang on, even when we're tired or in pain or have doubts. It's a good thing to fight for the relationship we share with God. Sometimes that might even mean a confrontation with God. Can we be angry with God? Yes. Can we tell God we do not understand how the world works? Why not? By being honest, we are struggling to hang on in those times when the world or God's methods or God's kingdom just does not make sense. The Bible's full of holy arguments, not arguments against God, but arguments with God. And the difference is everything. A rebel argues because he wants out of the relationship. A friend argues because the relationship matters too much to fake. Once you see that distinction, you start seeing it everywhere. The kind of faith that is mature to argue and faithful enough to yield. Take Moses. When Israel cast the golden calf and God announces destruction on the nation and the need to start over, Moses does not step aside and let wrath have its way. He reminds God of God's divine promises. He appeals to God's own reputation among the watching nations. He dares to say, "Turn from your fierce wrath." And the astonishing thing is not merely that Moses spoke, it's that God listened. The story says that the Lord relented, not because Moses overpowered God, but because the covenant friendship had become a real conversation, and a real conversation can change things. And what about Jesus? Watch him in the garden. The Father sets before his beloved Son the very cup toward which all of history has been bending. If ever there were a moment for silent, stoic obedience, Gethsemane is it. Instead, Jesus talks. He tells the Father exactly what he feels and exactly what he fears and exactly what he wants. 3 times he prays it. Luke says his sweat fell like great drops of blood. The book of Hebrews remembers loud cries and tears. The perfect Son does not suppress his humanity in order to obey. He brings his humanity into the conversation. every fear, every anguish, every desire laid open before the Father. Nothing hidden, nothing withheld, nothing cleaned up. God prefers honest wrestling to flawless theology offered from a safe distance. God would rather have the anguished conversation than perfect doctrine. One last thing. It's important to notice that the people of God are not named after Abraham, the crosser over. They are named Israel, after his grandson. And the story stops to spell out exactly what the name means. By the Jabbok in the dark, a man wrestles with God and will not let go until he is blessed. And God says, "Your name shall be Israel, because you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." The nation takes its name from the wrestle, from the grip that would not loosen, the limping, sweating, all-night argument that would not say uncle. God did not name God's people those who obey. God named them those who contend with God and prevail. The covenant people carry in their very name the lesson Abraham forgot on the mountain. Abraham was guilty of letting go. Jacob righted the wrong. He passed the wrestling test. And so we too are called the wrestlers. Amen.